Boldwood presents Fallout, written by Edie Baylis and read by Annie Aldington. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. 10th of July, 1995. Tom Bedworth pulled his leather jacket tighter, his face screwing up in irritation. Whatever had died in the aid of making this coat certainly hadn't lived anywhere but a tropical climate, because it was about as warm as a fucking ice cube. He knew he should have had a service done on this motor before leaving, but there wasn't the time to mess about checking if car heaters worked before putting a wide berth between him and the likes of the Reynolds and the Stokers. What was left of them anyway? Tom grinned. It looked like he'd been given a clean slate, and therefore he intended to use it. Now the Stokers had offed John Maynard, and hearing nothing else to the contrary, it must mean they had no inkling that he had been involved in anything, or that he even existed. Oh yes, John Maynard had done him the world of good. Tom smiled. Thanks to Maynard's connections with the Reynold family, Tom had made a nice sum from the sale of his own kid many years ago, albeit getting ripped off by the paltry price Len Reynold had paid for the prize of owning his offspring. But that would soon be rectified. Yeah, John Maynard had been extremely generous for taking the rap for everything else since. Oh, Maynard, you didn't die in vain. The Stoker boys lifting Maynard could only mean they believed him to be the one who'd killed their little brother Gary, and who'd helped Len Reynold faceplant into a tree. They probably even believed him to be the one behind the blackmailing of Gloria Reynold. That's if they even knew about that bit, which was doubtful, considering they were all thick as shit. This was, of course, wonderful. So the only thing of any concern was to proceed with his new plan. But he couldn't push his luck. Not until he was 100% sure he wasn't under suspicion. However, the most important thing, Samantha Reynold, his daughter, was still intact and very much alive. Tom glanced out of the window at the coming dawn, unsure of the time. It was early, that was for sure. OK, so it hadn't been part of his plan to spend days sleeping in the car. But why waste dosh on one of the few flea-ridden bed and breakfast gaffs around here, when you needed to save every penny in order to tide him over until his ship came in? And that wouldn't be long now. Not long at all. Now, on to Linda Matthews. Thanks to his expert detective work and a few chinwags in a handful of the local boozers, it hadn't taken long to discover where the old slapper lurked. Even picturing Linda's face, the way she used to fawn over him and cling like a limpet, wound him up. Getting her in the family way 30 years ago hadn't been one of his better ideas, but even epic fails had their upsides. If he hadn't got her knocked up, then he wouldn't have got that initial payout, and neither would he have had the ability to capitalise on it now. So yeah, he'd put up with Linda again, for a short period of time. Actually, she was Linda Devlin now. Hearing this had freaked Tom out somewhat. The husband on the scene meant a spanner in the works, but he needn't have fretted. Someone had been stupid enough to marry the woman, but had seen sense, and according to what he'd been told, the marriage had been short-lived, with the bloke disappearing yonks ago. It also hadn't taken much more digging to discover Linda was exactly where he'd expected her to end up, in this bloody ghetto of a dump. Tom glanced up at the concrete monstrosity in front of him. He'd also been correct in surmising her dictator of a father had long since dropped off the twig, as had his holier-than-thou wife, but Linda was still breathing. And that was good. Linda didn't know it yet, but she was the ticket to get him ensconced within the Reynold fold, and that would mean he got his money. Tom rummaged in his pocket for his lighter. Yeah, Linda would come in handy. He'd got it all planned. Instead of continuing to blackmail Gloria Reynold and threatening to tell the whole city that she and her cheapskate husband had paid a pittance for the child they had the cheek to call their own, Linda would get Samantha on side and explain who she really was. Once Sam had recovered from the shock, She'd fall over herself to help out her real parents, and then he'd get the payout he should have received in the first place. Ramping up the pressure with that old bag Gloria could now be reassigned as backup if the plan for Linda didn't pan out. And there was absolutely zilch reasons why it wouldn't. As for Linda, well, he'd promise her whatever she liked, but in reality, she'd get fuck all. He'd put her in the same orbit as her precious long-lost daughter, so what else could she possibly want? Tom winced as a freight train thundered past, its endless caravan of wagons jarring the teeth remaining in his head. This night, just gone, had been the last he'd spend in the motor. Tonight, he'd be in there. He looked up at the third floor. Yep, tonight he'd make Linda's life 1,000 times better, and because of that, she'd welcome him with open arms. Once things were in the pipeline, he'd fuck her off and head back to the Aurora to see how much his club's profits had increased during his absence. Tom's mouth twisted into a self-satisfied smile. He'd also got an extra way of increasing his income further. It had been in his plan anyway, and although she didn't realise it yet, Samantha would be taking on that part. This unplanned holiday had given him time to set up the means of crack production. Hanging around his neck of the woods offered the handy ability to dig up more people he knew from old, many who were happy to earn a few quid and ask no questions, purely because either they were desperate for cash or plain fucking stupid. Tom reached into the passenger seat footwell for the sandwich he'd nicked last night from the spa. He stared at the sorry-looking item within the plastic packet, wondering which half of the sandwich contained the alleged ham. As the sarnie had rolled around the footwell for the best part of the night, he hoped he wouldn't get food poisoning, but having eaten worse things, he'd take the chance. Besides, he'd need all his strength to deal with Linda. He'd eat this, have a bit of his remaining crack, and then pay the scabby old tart a long overdue visit. Chapter 1. Gloria Reynold didn't want to venture to the shops, but what could she do? Being completely out of bread, she had no choice but to go out to buy some. Len had always arranged deliveries of their food from the best butchers and greengrocers in Birmingham, but since his death, she couldn't face returning the calls about her next orders. It was too much of a painful reminder. There were lots of things in their well-stocked freezer, but she'd barely touched a morsel since Len's death, and that dreadful business of Samantha finding out the truth. But there was only so long she could go on like this. At the very least, she must force a sandwich down. Gloria walked towards the small collection of shops Edgbaston offered, sure everyone was staring at her. The truth about Sam's real parentage could already be out. It may have been spreading around the city like an out-of-control forest fire for days, yet she had no idea, because she hadn't seen anyone since the night she told the truth, including her daughter. Days now with no word, and it was breaking her heart clean in two. Not only had she lost her husband forever, but it looked as if she'd lost her daughter too. Gloria kept her eyes fixed ahead as she continued walking, if only to keep the rising urge to break down in tears at bay. She wished more than anything that she and Len had told Sam the truth from the start. If they'd told her from an early age, then she might not be in this position of having damaged her daughter's trust and wrecked their relationship. When Samantha had arrived in her life, Gloria had been so bothered about what everyone would think if they knew she'd had to adopt. But what must everyone think of her now? And Judith and Mal Stoker must hate her more than most for allowing the rumour to continue circulating that it was their youngest whose parentage was in question, rather than Samantha. How could she have sat on the truth? How could she have pretended she didn't know that rumour was about her, whilst allowing the suspicion between Judith's sons to continue? She still didn't know whether Gary Stoker had even returned to his family. Gloria almost tripped on the pavement, her haste to return to the safety of being behind closed doors growing. She was a coward, a pathetic, snivelling coward. Feeling a rising panic racing through her ribcage, her breathing became laboured. The blue sky lowered and the pavement tipped at a strange angle. She couldn't continue. She needed to get away from the gaping expanse of the outdoors where there were people. Rapidly stopping, Gloria yelped, almost passing out from sheer fright as she smacked into someone. Her handbag dropped to the floor, the contents scattering across the pavement. "I thought it was you." Liam Taylor took in Gloria's grey, terrified face. "Are you all right?" Steadying her with his arm, he gathered the contents of the handbag from the floor. "Come and sit down. You look like you might pass out." Gloria stared at Liam, wide-eyed. "No. I need to go home. Liam gently lowered Gloria onto a bench at the side of the road. "Just sit down for a second, and then I'll walk you back. I'll call Sam, and she can—" "No," Gloria cried. "You mustn't." The tears ran freely down her cheeks. "Sam doesn't want anything to do with me anymore. I haven't seen John either, and I don't know what to do." "What are you talking about?" Liam gasped. He hadn't seen Sam or John for the last week either. The only word he'd had was days ago when Sam had called, explaining she was taking a bit of time off to get her head together, and that she'd be in touch. Liam frowned. As their last meeting hadn't exactly finished on good terms, he'd thought it best to give her space, but now he wished he'd bypassed that. He looked at the worry on Gloria's face. "I don't know what's happened, but you should tell me so I can help you sort it out." Gloria sagged with relief. The need to unburden herself from the crushing weight of her terrible decision and what it had caused was immense. Liam had been close to Samantha for 10 years. He was almost like a son-in-law. Even Len had believed he would soon be just that. So if anyone could get through to Sam and put this right, it was Liam. Clutching his hand, Gloria began to speak. Andrew Stoker repositioned his well-built frame in the driver's seat of his Rover SD1 and rolled his shoulders to ease the ever-building tension. Through the twilight, he focused on the small terraced house halfway along the street, then stole a glance at his Rolex. Most of this lot around here would be well away in the local boozer by now, and wouldn't bat an eyelid. Not that anyone would dare question him, or any of his brothers. But that might soon change if things were allowed to slide. His eyes fixed on the front door of the target house. And she was not helping matters. Andrew's mouth flattened into a thin line as he ran his hand across his cleanly shaven jaw. Thanks to Baker, he was well aware of what had been alleged, and that would be sorted right now. He snorted in derision, the air from his nostrils creating a small fogged patch on the side window of the car. It was all very well his brother Seb insisting on paying loads of money to keep Detective Inspector Baker on side. But what was the bloody point if he wasn't present when the cop showed his face? Of course, Baker had come to speak to Seb, like everybody did, but Seb wasn't there, so he'd dealt with it instead. And it was a good bloody job. All that grief he'd got from Seb about overriding his decision and killing Phil Blunt. Seb's high horse stance had been pointless. Phil knew Seb had killed that geezer in the Aurora, so regardless of what Seb thought, offing Phil was the right thing to do. Phil might have been one of their own, but they couldn't risk moving him out of the country, even as a temporary measure like Seb wanted. Oh, Andrew had tried to reason with his brother. What happened if Phil opened his gob down the line? Or if someone tortured the info out of him? Where would that leave them? But Seb wasn't having any of it, and still wanted to let the man walk, so he'd been overridden. Simple as that. Andrew sighed. This latest development proved he'd been right to take the initiative and get rid of the man. Just look how untrustworthy his bloody missus had turned out. Thought she was clever by involving the old Bill, did she? Andrew's handsome face twisted into a scowl. Luckily, he'd been around when D.I. Baker had shown up to tell them Tonya Blunt was flapping her gums. Otherwise, they'd have been unaware. Staring at his neat fingernails in the dim gloom of the streetlight, Andrew knew he had to act fast. Seb had barely set foot in the Royal Peacock for a week, finding it preferable to bark orders at him and Neil down the blower, rather than be there in person to deal with the problems they still faced. Well, no guesses where Seb was now, and why. Andrew resented Sam Reynold more with every minute that passed. But one burning question persisted. Was it down to her using what was between her legs to twist Seb in her favour, or was the reticence down to Seb himself? After all, Seb had spent the last few days at Sam's side rather than with them, and Andrew would not have had the likes of her diluting their power as a firm. For God's sake, Seb had been against the woman at the start, but since she'd got her claws into him, his attitude had miraculously changed, which was concerning, really concerning. Sam may have helped on the night of Gary's murder, plus she hadn't attempted to deny her cousin John Maynard was behind all of the problems, but that didn't give her the right to expect their family to carry the can for one of them not being a blood relation, when that unpalatable accolade belonged to her all along. Sure, it was a shock for her, but to be frank, he didn't give a fuck. It certainly didn't justify why their brother was lying in a freezer like a pork chop, and their mother still believed there was a chance her youngest son would return home any day. Neither did it warrant running the risk that soon, and very soon, their mother would involve the old Bill by filing Gary as a missing person. If it became public Gary had been offed, then other things could be uncovered too. They may have succeeded in deflecting that so far, but it would not last forever, and neither should it. As much as he'd like to, Andrew couldn't take back the terrible way he treated his youngest brother, but the least he could do was ensure Gary got a proper send-off, and that should not be delayed a moment longer. Seeing a light in the front room of the terraced house flick on, Andrew zipped up his leather jacket and fired the engine of the SD1, the throaty roar loud in the otherwise quiet Yardley Road. Well, it stops here, Andrew thought bitterly. Sick of playing second fiddle, he wasn't towing the line any longer, not like Neil. Andrew and his brother Neil might be identical looking and think along the same lines, but when push came to shove, his twin followed whatever Seb decided. But he wasn't following what Seb decided. Their father had chosen the wrong son to run the firm. There would be no more pussyfooting around with the firm's reputation and standing. No fucking way. And he wasn't having cops digging around because of Phil Blunt's tart wife either. Pressing lightly on the accelerator, Andrew reversed along the street. Killing the engine, he flicked the headlights off, then tugged a pair of black leather gloves from his pocket. Pulling them onto his large hands, he stepped from his car and rapped on the door of the house. "Evening, Tonya." Andrew ensured his voice sounded as amiable as it perhaps might have done if this stupid cow hadn't opened her gob. A flicker of hope shone in Tonya Blunt's eyes. "Is this about Phil?" "I understand he's gone AWOL," Andrew said, his voice cleverly neutral as he watched Tonya shuffle nervously. He glanced over the top of her head into the living room. "We've located him." Tonya sagged with relief. "You found him? Oh, thank God. Where is he?" "He's fine. But your kids? Any idea where they are?" Andrew asked, his eyes glinting. "What do you mean? My sister's got the kids at the moment. I've been too worried about Phil to cope." Tonya flapped. "Where is he? Can I—" "Come with me." Sensing Tonya's building worry, Andrew smiled reassuringly before gesturing for her to step out of the house. "Don't worry. He's at the club with Seb." "At the club?" Tonya frowned. "Why hasn't he come straight home? I've been so worried." After a quick glance up the street, silently gratified to find the coast clear, Andrew steered Tonya out of the house and led her towards his car, chivalrously opening the passenger door. Getting in the driver's side, he replaced his smirk with an understanding smile. "Things have been getting on top of Phil." He started the engine and pulled away from the curb. Tonya looked horrified. "But why?" "Who knows?" Driving as quickly as possible out of Yardley, Andrew glanced at Tonya. "We'll give him extra work at the firm, if it will help." "That's really kind," Tonya said, her eyes filling up. "Money has been tight lately. I reported him as missing only yesterday. I probably shouldn't have. I was just so worried. I hope the police don't cause you problems. I might have said things that make—" "It's understandable you've been concerned," Andrew said calmly, his hands gripping the wheel harder. Suddenly noticing the view from the window wasn't what was expected, Tonya paused. "Why are we heading towards Spaghetti Junction? This isn't the way to the club." "You're right, it isn't," Andrew said. his voice now a snarl. Tonya scrambled for the door handle. "I want to get out! This isn't right!" Andrew chuckled. "You're spot on there, love. But speaking to the police isn't right either." From her seat at the two-seater table she'd squashed into the corner of the tiny kitchen, Linda Devlin opened her 4th can of Safeway's own brand cider and took a long swig. Using her elbow, she swiped the Legos scattered amidst cigarette ash overflowing from the ashtray across the scuffed blue Formica tabletop on the floor. "Take one," she shrieked. "Get your ass in here now and clear this up." Fucking kids, leaving a bloody mess everywhere all the goddamn time. With difficulty, she dragged herself off the rickety chair as her youngest raced into the kitchen like a dervish. "What's up, Ma?" "What's up?" Linda yelled. "This is what's up, you little shit." She pointed to the Lego on the floor and then prodded her son in his bony chest with her chipped fingernail. "How am I supposed to keep this place tidy when all you do is mess the bloody gaff up? You know I'm knackered, and your tea'll be ready in a minute." Taquin's bottom lip quivered as he stared at the Lego car he'd painstakingly built, now in several pieces on the floor. "Me dad bought me this," he sniffed, "and you bust it." "Then you shouldn't have left it in the way, should you?" Linda snapped, refusing to allow the sadness on her son's little face to pull at her heartstrings. "If it's bust, your dad can fucking well buy you another one." Not that there was much chance of that. She'd only seen the boy's father 3 times since the birth, and each time he'd filched money off her. Watching her son scrabble on the filthy kitchen floor to retrieve what could be salvaged of his treasured Lego, Linda moved to the grill to check the fish fingers to deflect from her steadily rising guilt. "Call your sister and tell her the tea's ready. There ain't anything else after this, so if she don't come and get it, it will go in the bin." Watching Taquin abandon his Lego to get his sister, Linda sighed. All she wanted to do was go down the pub, but there was no chance of that for at least another hour until these two were in bed. Reaching for a can of cider, she took another swig, then sparked up a cigarette, waiting the last couple of minutes for the fish fingers to finish. There were no chips left, so they'd have to make do with a fish finger sarnie. Christ, she was too old for this shit. 45 and still lumbered with 2 kids under 7. At least the rest of her kids were making their way in the world. Or she hoped so, anyway. Reminding herself of that on a regular basis made her feel a bit better about her failure. Sort of. Linda's face screwed up into a scowl. Once a fine-looking woman, any trace of that had long since departed, thanks to years of abusing just about any substance she could get her hands on. Pulling 2 plates from the sink, stacked high with unwashed dishes, she sluiced some water over them, drying them with the edge of her baggy T-shirt. As she turned, she spotted her 2 youngest sitting patiently at the table. Forcing herself to smile, she shoved fish fingers between what was left of the bread, then dumped the plates in front of them. "There you go. Eat up and then it's bedtime." Linda watched her 2 youngest shovel food into their mouths and wished they'd hurry up so that she could go out. Then she could finally relax, except she couldn't, because the guilt would still be there. Miserably, she stubbed her fag out in the sink. As much as she preferred to tell herself it didn't matter, in reality, it did. The guilt, wedged in the back of her mind, haunted her every day. Each time she'd got pregnant, she'd convince herself this was the time to make up for all the other children she'd failed, lost or screwed up. But it never worked. Every time she plummeted into an endless pit of despair, and the kids suffered. And it was all because of the first one, the one who had been taken from her. It had all gone downhill from there. That day, in 1965, was as crystal clear in Linda's mind as it had always been, as though 30 years meant nothing. She could see it now, watching herself staring through the mottled glass of her bedroom window in her parents' house. She'd known the car belonging to the stranger downstairs had cost more than a few quid, and remembered thinking she should be relieved and grateful the person was well off and able to provide for her baby. But she hadn't been. She just wanted the man to leave. She'd concentrated on the small bundle that she'd placed in the centre of her bed, creating the smallest of dents on the pink bedspread, and her heart had felt like it might shatter. She'd tried really hard not to get attached, but she'd failed. Scooping the baby up, she'd held the child tightly against her chest, her tears falling onto the tiny little face. Kissing the top of her baby's head, fuzzy little tufts of dark hair tickling her nose, she strove to commit to memory the smell, that unique scent she'd heard people say babies had, which she'd never fully understood until that moment. She'd promised to memorise every single detail of her daughter's perfect little face, watching tiny starfish hands jerk out to grasp anything within reach. And then her mother had entered the bedroom. She'd just walked in like it had been a normal day, and that day had been indelibly etched into Linda's brain ever since. She told her mother that she didn't want to go through with it, that she'd changed her mind, and that she wanted the man downstairs to go away. But it had fallen on deaf ears. She'd had no choice but to watch as the carry cot was lifted from the bedroom floor, her baby placed inside, and along with a small bag with a few items of clothing the child possessed, her mother had taken everything, shutting the door behind her. Linda didn't want to think about this. Every bloody day, it forced itself into her mind and she was sick of it. She could never make up for what had happened. She tried, but all it did was make things worse. Fluctuating between hating herself and not giving a shit, achieved nothing. But it all came back to the same thing. She was a worthless, pointless woman who should have been sterilised at birth. Linda suddenly froze, hearing banging on the front door. She edged out of the kitchen, praying it wasn't the guy about the rent again. She knew she was behind, but she just hadn't got it to spare. Not if she wanted cider and fags. Deciding it was sensible to ignore the caller, she was about to shut the kitchen door to muffle the noise when a voice shouted her name, a voice that, despite not having heard it for a very long time, she'd have recognised anywhere. It was the voice of the only man she'd ever loved, the person who had started her on the downward spiral of her life. A mixed bag of fear, anger and exhilaration rushed up Linda's spine as she reached for the door handle. Could this really be happening? Could it be that Tom had finally come back for her, like he'd always promised? Chapter 2. Putting the phone down in his apartment in the Royal Peacock, Seb Stoker scowled. He'd already briefed his police contact Baker over what must go on the record about Gary. So why were they here? He glanced at himself in the floor-length hallway mirror, straightened his tie and smoothed his hand over his slicked-back, almost black hair. Whatever the police wanted, they'd better not take long. He had too much to catch up with. It had taken a lot of internal power to pull himself away from Sam, but she was right. They had to get back to the business in hand. It had been several days since he'd properly concentrated on anything other than exploring every inch of her body. OK, so he'd kept things ticking over via phone, as well as putting things in the pipeline about Gary's death. But the main reason for his absence wasn't due to putting things into place at the Orchid, like he'd told his brothers. Not really, unless the phone call Sam had made to that Liam bloke last week and some other Kevin geezer counted. But Seb regretted not a second of it. For a short period of time, and probably for the first time he could remember since walking out of school, not bothering to return for his O-levels, Seb had felt as though his life didn't consist solely of a large roundabout turning endlessly around problems, grief and issues surrounding the family firm. And for that short amount of time, he'd experienced what it might be like to be almost normal, whatever that was. But it made little difference, because this was his life, and this was how it would be. End of. And he'd barely been back long enough to put on a fresh suit before something else had kicked off. Something to rapidly remind him who he was and what his job consisted of. Like he could ever forget. Pulling the apartment door closed, Seb hurried down the stairs. He led himself through the adjoining door leading into the staff area and saw Andrew heading his way. I got the message. What's going on? Andrew gave his brother a long, cold look. If you'd been here yesterday when Baker arrived to give you an off-the-record heads-up, then you'd know an official visit was expected today. It's about Phil. Phil, Seb ignored Andrew's reference to his absence and made long strides down the corridor towards his office. Yep, not back an hour, and already shit's hitting the fan. If the old Bill were here because of Phil, then Andrew would do well to remember that it had been his actions that had caused this in the first place. I'll handle them. Have they spoken to you yet? Yep. Me and Neil said exactly what we agreed, should this happen. Seb nodded and jerked his head towards the door. Make yourself scarce, and I'll get rid of them. Seb gave Andrew time to slip out the corridor before fixing an easy-going smile in place and opening the door to his office. Good morning, gentlemen. Sorry to keep you waiting. I hope this won't take long. He glanced at his watch. I'm a busy man. He turned to D.I. Baker, noting the slight nod of acknowledgement. He wouldn't be held up, not if Baker was here. The man was paid enough to ensure the Peacock and everyone in it was kept out of the limelight, and had just received his highest payout yet. Sorry to intrude, Mr. Stoker. The younger policeman extended his hand. I'm D.S. Drakeman. D.S. Drakeman has recently joined our team, Mr. Stoker, D.I. Baker explained pointedly. Seb shook the proffered hand. A new plot with something to prove. He guessed Baker was accompanying the man to ensure things ran smoothly. I would appreciate it if we could make this quick. Now, how can I be of assistance? D.S. Drakeman's slightly overweight frame moved from one leg to the other. It's rather awkward. He glanced at his superior. There's been an allegation. Seb raised an eyebrow. An allegation? Philip Blunt is missing. His wife contacted us 2 days ago. She said you might know something about it. Seb frowned. He knew it. That silly bint had filed Phil as a missing person. You're obviously aware the man works for me. Otherwise he wouldn't be here. But if he's gone AWOL, why would I know about that? If anyone knows, it's his bloody wife. He laughed, catching the slight shake of Baker's head. Seb changed tack. This new DS was clearly not au fait with their arrangement, and it was better staying that way if he was as much of a job's worth as he acted. Folding his arms, Seb stared at the DS. Joking aside, it was recently brought to my attention that Phil failed to show for a shift. He lied, watching the man jot something down in his notebook. It's out of character, because Phil has always been reliable. He pulled on a concerned expression. I hope he isn't involved in something untoward. We want a kosher ship here at the Peacock, and if he's mixed up in something, then I'd appreciate it if it... Mr. Blunt is still missing, Mr. Stoker, the DS interrupted. His wife also informed us that he was hurt quite badly a couple of weeks beforehand, and now that he's disappeared. Unease slithered into Seb's brain. What the fuck had this woman said? I hope you're not insinuating any of that is to do with me. D.I. Baker glared at D.S. Drakeman, then smiled at Seb. Not at all. Not taking the hint, Drakeman continued. Mrs. Blunt said her husband refused to say how he came to be injured, but she thinks it might be connected with me. Seb finished the sentence, his blood simmering. Bloody Andrew disobeying him by taking Phil out had never been the plan. He'd been all set on giving the wife a decent payout, but now she'd decided to turn the tables. The silly bitch would have a long wait. Looking at the date in question of Phil's disappearance and D.S. Drakeman's notepad, Seb pulled his desk diary from the drawer. He flicked through the pages, then closed it with a flourish. If you're in need of my whereabouts on the night in question, I can confirm I was here until 2 a.m, he said, his voice frosty. That wouldn't be refuted. His staff knew how to play the game. That can be substantiated by the many people working here, or the customers. I can provide you with a list of who was present that night. Cutting D.I. Baker a look, Seb strode towards his filing cabinet and opened the drawer. That won't be necessary, D.I. Baker said hastily. I think you've helped more than enough with our inquiries. He looked at D.S. Drakeman. Would you not say, Detective Sergeant? Well, Mr. Stoker's account matches those of his brothers, so I don't think we need to take up any more of his time. Seb scowled. Until this business with Gary was sorted, he needed the bastard on side. But if Baker wanted their arrangement to continue, he needed to have words with his underlings before a healthy percentage of his monthly payments were docked. D.I. Baker smiled uncomfortably. Again, apologies for interrupting you. Seb nodded tersely at the detective inspector, his body thrumming with resentment for the 100th time since Andrew had taken the impetus to go against his orders. D.I. Baker ushered D.S. Drakeman from the office. We'll see ourselves out. As the door closed behind the two men, Seb exhaled through his teeth and poured himself a shot of whiskey. Knocking it back in one, he wiped his hand across his mouth and straightened his tie once again. Nope. It hadn't taken long to feel like the pleasure of the last few days had been nothing more than a hallucination. Walking into the Violet Orchid, Sam Reynold returned the doorman's smile and mechanically acknowledged the greetings from the staff as she made her way along the corridor. Approaching her office, she overrode the reluctance her legs felt nearing the area where Gary had been murdered. She'd been uncomfortable here since, but had hoped her short absence would have removed the uneasiness. Unfortunately, it hadn't. Neither had it done anything to dilute the long list of problems she still faced. If anything, they were clamouring louder than ever before. Unlocking her office door, she pushed it wide open, the confident movement hiding the flickering nervousness she must keep under wraps. All that's over now, Sam reminded herself. Slipping off her jacket, she placed it neatly around the back of her desk chair. Sitting down, she retrieved her diary from the drawer and stared at it blankly. With the removal of John Maynard, the threats and the worry of who had been causing problems to her father's firm, along with the Stokers' business, was no longer an issue. Yet there were so many other things to sort out. Her lips pursed resolutely, like stopping referring to the orchid and all other parts of the business as her father's. It was hers now. That was something else to deal with. It was imperative she found out the truth about her real identity. That was something she'd never paid attention to before. Why would she? There had never been a reason to think she was anyone other than who she'd always been. Samantha Reynold. She hadn't thought about how it must feel not to know who she really was, but now she did. And it was horrible. Sam fished out the small mirror from her handbag and stared at her reflection. The heart-shaped face, the dark hair and brown eyes, framed by long lashes, were the same. Everything was the same. Except she wasn't the same. What she did know was that she shared no blood with the people she'd always believed to be her family, and until she discovered whose blood she did share, she wouldn't rest. Placing the mirror back in her handbag, Sam pulled the diary back in front of her. Although Seb had been a great help in explaining how certain parts of businesses like theirs worked, the vast majority of the ins and outs of the casino and its subsidiaries was still a gaping hole in her knowledge. But what she did know was that the attitude of some of the workers had to change. The casino staff had been accommodating of her taking her father's place, but the other side of the business, the side her cousin John Maynard had run, was a different story, and there she faced an uphill battle. But she'd had to start somewhere, so she'd picked Kevin Stanton, one of John's main men, to run that side in her absence. Whether she could trust him, she didn't know, but what choice did she have? John had done his utmost to make his staff robotically loyal. Nothing wrong with that. Had it not been that he'd been working against her, her father, and the business all these years. Sam rested her chin in her hands. How would she explain that to the workforce? How could she explain anything without letting the collection of men trained in savage extortion, violence, drug dealing, and other unsavoury facets of the business know what John had done and what had happened to him? Even she wasn't sure. After leaving the lock-up that day, she had no idea where John's body had been taken or how it had been disposed of. Something else she would have to discuss with Seb. And they really should have spent more time discussing things like that, rather than... Sam's cheeks flushed with the memories of the past few days. While Sebastian Stoker had brought her to new heights, her mind was not on the myriad of things plaguing her. The 1,000,001 issues sat on her shoulders like a weighted rucksack, which dragged her further into the quicksand the more she thought about what they entailed and what it all meant. During the time Seb's mouth was on hers, his hands on her skin, and his body possessing hers, she thought of nothing, apart from the avalanche of sensations and the mind-blowing crescendos that without fail he gave her every single time. In those moments, she was removed from the torturous confusion, worry, and the all-consuming anger over everything that had occurred. But she'd known by making that decision to give in to what her body had yearned for since the day she'd met Seb Stoker, brought its own set of issues. Seb was dangerous, violent, and unpredictable, the very opposite of what she should want. But want him she did, with every fibre of her being. He excited her, fired her, set her alight. Everything about him made her feel alive. But now the line had been crossed. She didn't know what it meant. The sudden tapping at her office door took any further thoughts from her mind. Clearing her throat, Sam called, "Enter." Chapter 3. "How are things going with Kevin?" Liam asked. "I passed him in the corridor on the way to see you." "It's a bit early to say as yet," Sam replied tersely. She thought the knock on the door might be Kevin Stanton. She was expecting him for their first proper meeting since she'd asked him to temporarily take over John's position. She certainly hadn't expected Liam. She hadn't wanted to see Liam. Wearing a neutral expression, Liam stared at Sam. He knew things hadn't been left well between them, but he'd faithfully stuck by her side, waiting in the wings for a decade, sure his patience would eventually be rewarded. But how long could he skirt around what he'd learnt from Gloria? What Sam hadn't breathed a bloody word to him about, and also the other question, where the hell was John Maynard? He studied Sam intently, his annoyance growing. He was right. She wasn't going to say a single thing. "I bumped into Gloria yesterday," Liam said, unable to remain silent any longer. "She's in a real state. Why haven't you told me about what happened?" Sam's head jerked up. She told you about..." "She told me everything. You know, that little thing about her and Len not being your real parents." Sam flinched. She didn't want to discuss this. Not with Liam. Not with anyone. Liam rubbed his hand over his goatee beard. Gloria had also added that Seb Stoker was present when she told Sam the truth, and he couldn't quite put into words how much it galled him that particular man knew of this before he did. His face screwed up. He'd fallen in the pecking order, something which had to be rectified. "You used to tell me everything. I thought at the very least we were supposed to be friends." "We were," Sam cried. "I mean, we are." And yes, she used to tell Liam everything, but that was before, well, everything changed. Guilt twinged. "I haven't even got my head around it myself." Liam bit back his scowl. She'd discussed it with Stoker, though. Oh, yeah, she'd discussed it with him, the bastard. "Gloria said no one, including her, knows who these people are that..." "I really don't want to talk about it," Sam said, fidgeting uncomfortably. Liam tried his best to look sympathetic, but really he wanted to scream at her for sitting there like she was the only person in the fucking world. But he'd continue playing the game, because he intended to turn this around. As much as it stuck in his throat, he wasn't chucking away what he'd worked for, because Sam was stupid enough to let Stoker shove his dick in her. The thought of her sleeping with that man made his skin crawl, but he wasn't stupid. He'd heard on the grapevine that Stoker had been absent from the Royal Peacock, which, funnily enough, coincided with Sam's break away from the Orchid, so it stood to reason she was involved with that psycho nutter, just as he'd suspected. "Sam," Liam said, "your silence tells me something's not right. Where's John? I know you're unhappy with him for reasons you won't divulge, but he's only looking out for you and the business. If you stopped letting that Stoker man cloud your judgment, then you..." "This is nothing to do with Seb Stoker," Sam barked, losing her resolve to remain calm. Liam swallowed the accusations he longed to make. She'd been far too quick in jumping to Stoker's defence. She'd only kept the control of the Orchid, and become reluctant to go to John for assistance after Stoker had wheedled his way into her head. Why couldn't she see the man was playing her? She'd morphed into a hard-faced cow that in all honesty he no longer knew, let alone much liked. But more to the point, all of this scuppered his plans for a comfortable future as Sam's intended. And he'd bet his last quid it was all down to Sebastian Stoker, but he'd have to swallow it if he wanted his payout. Sam took another breath. I don't know where John is. That was true at least. Liam blinked. How can you not know where he is? Thinking on her feet, Sam folded her arms. He's disappeared. In all honesty, I think he's had a breakdown. Not long ago, she'd have told Liam the truth, as in the real truth, but not anymore. He was someone else she no longer trusted. John's not the type to have a breakdown, Liam exclaimed. Are you saying I'm making it up? No, but I didn't say it was definite. I said that's what I think, Sam replied. She was getting good at lying and thinking off the top of her head, and wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. I can give no other reason for his disappearance, apart from that he's dead. She shrugged. Look, it's complicated. It came to pass that John wasn't acting in the firm's best interests. My personal opinion is that he's done a flit because he knew it was only a matter of time before we all found out. That makes no sense, Liam exclaimed. John bent over backwards to help you. I really can't go into any more details. I'd be speculating, Sam said quickly. And I need you to promise me that you... You can't or won't. You say this is your opinion, but is it? Is it your opinion, or is it Seb? Liam stopped himself uttering Stoker's name. John wouldn't disappear. Neither would he have had some kind of breakdown. Stoker was behind this. Stoker had killed John. There was no alternative explanation, and Sam was covering it up. He inwardly fumed. That bastard Sebastian Stoker was taking everything, and Sam was allowing it. The stupid... As I was trying to say, Sam repeated, well aware of what was going through Liam's head. I haven't mentioned a word of this to anyone yet. I need to work out what to say to the staff. Liam stared at Sam. She was either lying or really was stupid enough to believe the bullshit she'd been fed while Stoker screwed her. This could not be allowed to continue. His skin tingled with unbridled fury. Why have you only just told me? Where have you been? And what the hell are you going to do about Gloria? You can't just ignore her, Sam. It's not acceptable. Sam felt like slapping Liam, but she had to keep it together. That's why I took time off. I needed a few days out to think. Yeah, I bet you did, Liam thought acidly. No guesses who with. And Gloria? Sam remained silent for a few moments, to control both her anger and to work out what to say. Liam had done her one favour, though. He'd underlined that she really did need a second in command. She was grateful when her desk phone rang, its shrill tone punctuating the heavy silence. Liam watched Sam pick up the receiver. Although he couldn't hear what was said, he could hear that gruff voice, the instantly recognisable one that sounded like the owner was gargling with barbed wire. And judging by the look on Sam's face, whatever Seb Stoker was saying, it wasn't anything she wanted to hear. Liam silently gestured that he'd leave Sam to it. He'd just had a good idea, a really good idea, and if it played out the way he wanted, it would kill two birds with one stone. And then he'd wait patiently until Sam saw sense. This time she'd run into his arms for good and he'd be sorted. If, on the other hand, it blew up in his face, then he would lose everything he'd worked so hard to achieve over the last 10 years. But if he didn't elbow Stoker out of the equation and out of Sam's life, then he was screwed anyway. The way things were heading, he had little to lose. Tom reached over Linda and grabbed another can of lager from the bedside table. Belching loudly, his eyes locked on Linda. How he'd kept the shock off his face when she'd opened the door last night, he hadn't a clue. Helping himself to Linda's tobacco, Tom rolled a cigarette on his naked thigh, uncomfortably aware her eyes were resting on his now flaccid cock. Forget the roll-up. He needed a ton of crack to continue screwing Linda for the foreseeable. But he shouldn't have smoked that rock last night. He'd wasted time when he could have been in here getting on with things. He stole a glance at Linda's weathered face. In the cold light of day, she looked worse than she did last night, if that were at all possible. She was younger than him, yet looked nigh on 20 years older. And he hadn't counted on there being two bastard kids here either. How many kids did you say you got? I didn't, Linda said. But 8 in total. Fucking hell, Tom exclaimed. You don't mess about, do you? Whatever else Linda had spent the last 30 years doing, The vast majority of it wasn't spent looking after her looks, but on her back, a stark contrast to the frigid virgin he'd broken in. "Who do they all belong to?" Linda shrugged and reached for a can of cider. "No one you'd know." She wasn't sure she knew about most of them either. Not for sure, anyway. Besides, it wasn't as if it mattered. She inhaled slowly, the question she'd wanted to ask since the moment she'd opened the door still burning on her lips. "Why are you here, Tom? I didn't ever expect to see you again." She watched Tom mull over her question. He'd retained a good percentage of that cheeky charm she'd been so besotted with as a teenager. But where had it got her, apart from a fast track to a life down the toilet? Seeing him again brought back his abandonment. Not that she'd ever forgotten. She'd just coped by drowning it out over the last 3 decades. But now it was just as fresh and painful as it had always been. Whilst wondering what the hell to say, Tom watched Linda light a cigarette and balance the ashtray on the duvet. Judging by the trembling of her bottom lip, he'd better hurry up and say something. Something believable that would get his feet back under the table. Shit deal or not, he was relying on her. He might have spent half the night screwing her, but there was more work to do than he'd thought. Jesus, why did women overcomplicate things? Forcing the preferable image of the nubile young body of Tina, who he'd left at his club, out of his mind, a massive contrast to this wrinkled, scabby tart, Tom grabbed Linda's hand. "Babe, I know I let you down. I was young, stupid and scared." He pulled his face into a practised contrite look. "Your dad's threats terrified me," he lied. "I thought it best to get out of your life." "Threats?" A lone tear rolled down Linda's cheek. "He gave you money, and you took it. I heard everything. You never once asked about me, or our baby. Your dad said I'd ruin your life. He said our kid would have a good life, a better life. I thought I was doing the right thing. I was a prat." "But I loved you," Linda wailed, throwing herself to the edge of the bed. "You said we were meant to be together, and that we'd get married. Then you disappeared. My life's been shit because of you, Tom Bedworth. Absolute shit." Tom watched Linda's shoulders heave in between her sobs. Christ, he must have been desperate for a shag if he'd said all that. And from what he recalled, the one time she'd opened her legs had been shit. His nose wrinkled. Judging by what he'd just experienced, she hadn't improved much since either. "That's why I'm here now, to make it up to you." Tom's hand stroked Linda's back. "I thought I might stay with you for a while and get to know each other again. I'm doing well now, Lynn." "Oh, that's okay then, isn't it?" Linda lurched to her feet and staggered across the room. Why had she been so stupid to let this man back into her bed? "As long as you're doing okay." Feeling exposed, she yanked her dressing gown on. Wait, was Tom saying he wanted her back after all this time? Despite everything, it was what she'd always wanted. "Lynn, listen, please, babe," Tom whined. Getting up, he wrapped his arms around Linda's waist from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder, careful to miss the dried egg stuck to the filthy pink fur of her robe. "I haven't been back in Brum long, only a few months, but I've got my own casino up the Hagley Road now and everything," he said proudly. His hand slipped inside Linda's dressing gown and played with one of her breasts. Feeling her nipple harden on cue, Tom smiled to himself. She still wanted him like crazy. She'd be putty in his hands. Hopelessly fighting against the powerful desire Tom had always sparked in her, Linda groaned with pleasure. "But why now, Tom? Why now?" Tom grinned, his lips against Linda's hair. He bypassed the stench of ingrained chips and instead concentrated on getting his hands on that lovely money from the violet orchid. The thought of that was the only thing in this room that could possibly make him hard. Pushing his erection against her buttocks, Tom continued kneading her breasts. "Oh, Linda, look what you've done to me again." He gasped for good measure. "God, I've missed you, girl." "But what about our daughter?" Linda breathed, leaning over the bed in anticipation. Tom paused. Was this a good time to drop the bombshell? It might save having to screw her again.
That's the other reason I'm here. I found out where our daughter is.
What? Linda shrieked, spinning around. Oh, my God, Tom! Really? My baby girl! Where is she? Have you met her? Tom inwardly congratulated himself on his timing.
Bingo. I've seen her, yes, but she doesn't know who I am. He smiled sweetly. I thought it only fair not to introduce myself. That's partly why I've been desperately trying to find you these past few weeks.
Oh, Tom! Linda wailed, now crying freely. She'd never thought this day would come. Giving up her firstborn had haunted her every single day. Maybe now she could put things right. Maybe at last she could be a proper mother to all of her children. Where is she? I want to go and see her.
We can't just turn up, Tom said hastily. She might not even know she's adopted. And that's another thing. It should be you she meets, not me. Meeting both of us at the same time could overwhelm her. He smiled sadly. She might even resent us for being together, being as we didn't keep her. We don't want her to think that, so it's better if I stay out the way.
Linda's heart crashed in her chest. So Tom was back for good. To be here with her. The two things she'd always wanted. Tom and her firstborn were within her grasp. What does she look like? Please tell me.
She's beautiful. Just like you.
Grimacing, Tom moved over to the other side of the room, glad to be away from Linda's close proximity. He fished a newspaper cutting he'd saved for this very purpose out of his pocket. The photo of Samantha Reynold, taken at the Orchid before he'd made the unfortunate mistake of killing her pretend father.
This is her.
Linda snatched the crumpled newspaper from Tom's hand, her eyes widening. Oh, my God, she cried, entranced. She's stunning. Tom smiled smugly, until Linda suddenly began sobbing and hyperventilating. He stood aghast, panic rising. What the fuck was going on? Was she having a heart attack? Oh, that would be typical. She drops dead just at the exact time she was finally of use.
I'll call an ambulance, he muttered, edging away. Or should he leg it?
No, Linda panted, her nails digging painfully into the skin of Tom's arm. I'm okay. I just need to lie down. Chapter 4.
Now that you've asked, but in case you're wondering, the old bill have gone.
Seb threw his suit jacket onto the back of the chair in his office.
Forget about them. They can't prove fuck all. I'm more bothered that it's been almost a fucking week you've been off the radar, leaving us to deal with everything, Andrew barked.
Seb wasn't in the mood to put up with his brother playing his face.
And there was me thinking you'd jump at the chance for more responsibility. Isn't that what you've always wanted?
Andrew glanced at Neil, identical irritation reflected in his twin's eyes.
Responsibility for our club and the family firm, sure, but not because you buggered off to bat for the other side with our bloody rivals, he spat. Jesus, Seb, you're on this firm, not Samantha Reynolds. For fuck's sake, what were you thinking?
Seb's eyes narrowed.
How many more times? Yes, I've been helping Sam out, but I've also been putting things into place for us too. We still have our own club and firm to run, Andrew continued. You can't just swan off.
Seb sat forward, his jaw clenched.
I'm here, aren't I? If you two can't fucking cope running the basics for a couple of days, then that speaks volumes. In case you'd forgotten, our brother's still lying in a chest freezer at the lockup. I've had Mum on the phone asking why we haven't located him yet, and Dad's been in twice, Andrew said, anger flooding to the fore. When are we dealing with it? Pacing around, he raked his fingers through his thick dark hair. Jesus Christ, what's the matter with you?